She stood in the town square while they laughed. The fat trapper's daughter nobody would touch. Then the most dangerous man in the territory pointed at her and said 3 words that changed everything. I choose her. What happened next in those frozen mountains would make the same people who mocked her beg for mercy at her feet. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far the story travels. The wind came down from the mountains like something with teeth. Elira Vos had learned that truth before she could walk, learned it in the marrow of her bones, in the perpetual ache of her joints, in the way cold settled into flesh and refused to leave until spring. Black Hollow didn't forgive weakness. The settlement crouched at the edge of the frontier like a wounded animal, all crooked timber and desperate faces, clinging to existence through sheer stubbornness and little else. She stood at the back of Harkin's general store, stacking crates of salted pork that smelled like brine and rot. Her hands were red and cracked despite the leather gloves, her breath coming out in clouds that hung in the frigid air. The store was empty except for old Harkin himself, counting coins behind the counter, with fingers so gnarled they looked like tree roots. "You're slow today," he said without looking up. Elira didn't respond. She'd learned that too. Silence cost nothing. "I said you're slow." "I heard you." She hefted another crate, her arms burning with the effort. The crate was heavy, but she'd moved heavier. Her father had made sure of that, back when he was still alive and still cared whether she lived or died. Harkin finally glanced up, his watery eyes narrowing. "Marshall's calling a gathering. Town square. You heard?" "I heard." Every unmarried woman's got to attend. He said it like he was commenting on the weather, but his mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile if it had any warmth behind it. "Even you, I suppose." Elira's stomach dropped. She'd heard the rumors. Everyone had. The marshal had declared that Black Hollow needed more women, more families, more bodies to work the land and keep the settlement from collapsing entirely. So he'd ordered what he called a bride choosing. Every unmarried woman between 15 and 40 had to stand in the square while the unmarried men selected wives. "I'm not going," she said quietly. Harkin laughed, a sound like gravel in a bucket. "You don't got a choice, girl. Marshall's orders. You don't show, he'll drag you there himself." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she'd rather freeze to death in the woods than stand in that square like livestock at auction. But Harkin had already gone back to his coins, dismissing her as thoroughly as if she'd never spoken at all. That was how it went in Black Hollow. Elira Vos was invisible until people needed something to mock. The town square was already packed when she arrived. Women clustered together near the platform that served as the marshal's stage for announcements and public punishments. Some of them were young, barely more than girls, their faces pinched with cold and fear. Others were older, widows or women whose marriages had fallen apart in the brutal frontier grind. They all had one thing in common. They looked trapped. The men gathered on the opposite side, trappers, ranch hands, drifters who'd washed up in Black Hollow because they had nowhere else to go. They watched the women with expressions ranging from bored indifference to naked hunger. Elira kept to the back, trying to make herself small. It was a skill she'd perfected over the years. Not that it ever really worked. "Look who showed up," someone muttered. The laughter started almost immediately. Quiet at first, just snickers and whispers, but it spread through the crowd like fire through dry brush. Didn't think she'd have the nerve. Who'd want her? Maybe if they're desperate enough. I'd rather stay single. Elira's face burned. She kept her eyes on the ground, focusing on the packed snow beneath her boots. It was easier than looking at their faces, easier than seeing the contempt. A woman named Clara sidled up beside her. Someone who'd gone to the same schoolhouse back when Black Hollow still had a teacher. Clara had been pretty once, before hard winters, and harder men had worn her down to something brittle. "Don't pay them any mind," Clara said, but her voice was flat. She didn't mean it. She was just saying words because that's what people did when they wanted to pretend they still had decency. "I won't," Elira replied, and that was true at least. Marshall Gaines stepped onto the platform. He was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a face like weathered granite and eyes that held all the warmth of a January midnight. He'd come to Black Hollow 5 years ago with a writ from the territorial governor and enough armed men to enforce his authority. Since then, he'd run the settlement like his personal kingdom. "Settle down," he barked, and the crowd fell silent. Gaines surveyed the assembled women with the same expression a rancher might give a herd of cattle. "You all know why you're here. Black Hollow's dying. We need families. We need children. We need women willing to work and men willing to provide." He paused, letting his words hang in the frozen air. "So here's how this works. The men will choose. If you're chosen, you got 3 days to marry. Anyone refuses, they can leave Black Hollow for good. We got no room for selfishness here." "What if nobody chooses us?" a young woman called out, her voice shaking. Gaines shrugged. "Then you stay unmarried, but you still got to contribute to the settlement. No freeloaders." It was a lie, of course. Everyone knew it. The women who weren't chosen would face even worse treatment than before, marked as worthless, used up, unwanted. The choosing began. One by one, men stepped forward and pointed. Sometimes they said a name. Sometimes they just gestured. The women who were chosen left the square with their new future husbands, some walking with heads high, others with tears streaming down their faces. Elira watched it all with a sick feeling in her stomach. She knew what was coming. She'd known from the moment Harkin told her about the gathering. The crowd was thinning. Most of the women were gone. Clara got chosen by a rancher who looked old enough to be her grandfather. A few younger girls went to trappers who'd promised them warm cabins and steady food. Lies, probably, but what choice did they have? Finally, only Elira remained. The men who were left, the ones nobody wanted, the ones too poor or too cruel or too broken, they looked at her and shook their heads. One by one they drifted away, preferring to stay alone rather than take her. The laughter was louder now, open and vicious. "Guess nobody's that desperate. Can you blame them?" She'd eat them out of house and home. Elira stood there alone in the center of the square while the entire town watched her humiliation. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to vanish into the snow and never come back. Marshall Gaines was about to dismiss the gathering when a voice cut through the noise. "I'll take her." The square went silent. Every head turned toward the source of the voice, a man standing at the very edge of the crowd, half hidden in shadow. Cade Mercer. Even people who'd never met him knew the name. He was the wolf hunter who lived alone on the mountain, the man who brought in more pelts than any 3 trappers combined, who survived blizzards that killed grown men, who once walked 40 miles through a snowstorm with a broken leg, just to deliver a warning about raiders to Black Hollow. He was a ghost, a legend, someone most people avoided because he carried violence around him like a second skin. He stepped into the light now, and Elira finally saw him clearly. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. His coat was wolf fur, thick and grey, and beneath it he wore leather and wool that had been repaired so many times the original fabric was barely visible. His face was hard, all sharp angles and old scars, but his eyes were worse, pale grey, cold as winter ice, giving away nothing. He walked through the crowd like it wasn't there, his boots crunching on packed snow, until he stood directly in front of Marshall Gaines. "I choose her," Cade said, pointing at Elira. The silence stretched. Someone coughed. Someone else laughed, uncertain. Gaines frowned. "You sure, Mercer? I said what I said. You could have any. I don't want any. I want her." The marshal looked between Cade and Elira, clearly trying to decide if this was some kind of elaborate joke. Finally, he shrugged. "Your funeral. 3 days to marry, or she leaves Black Hollow." "We'll marry tomorrow," Cade said flatly. Then he turned to Elira, and for the first time their eyes met. She expected disgust, expected cruelty, expected the same contempt she'd seen on every other face in that square. Instead, she saw nothing. just those cold grey eyes studying her like she was a puzzle he hadn't figured out yet. "Can you ride?" he asked. She blinked. "What? A horse? Can you ride one?" Yes, a little. Good enough." He gestured toward the edge of the square where a massive black horse stood waiting, its breath steaming in the cold. "We leave now." "Now?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I need to get my things." "What things?" She thought about her father's cabin, the thin bedroll, the 2 dresses she owned, both patched and faded, the wooden box that held her mother's wedding ring, and a lock of her father's hair from before the drinking got bad. "Not much," she admitted. "Then get them. I'll wait." The crowd was starting to murmur now, people realizing this wasn't a joke, that Cade Mercer had actually chosen the one woman nobody else wanted. "This is insane," someone said. "He's lost his mind." Maybe he feels sorry for her. That last comment hit harder than the rest. Pity, of course. That's what this was. He pitied her. Elira turned to walk away, to get her things and come back and accept this bizarre twist of fate, when Cade's voice stopped her. "They're wrong," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. "I don't do pity." She looked back at him. "Then why?" His expression didn't change. "You'll figure it out." Domag. The ride to Cade's mountain outpost took 6 hours. They travelled in silence, Cade on his black horse and Elira on a smaller grey mare he'd brought for her. The path climbed steadily upward, following a trail that was barely visible beneath the snow. The forest pressed in on both sides, dark pines that blocked out the sky, their branches heavy with ice. Elira had grown up in these mountains, but she'd never been this far from Black Hollow. Her father had always said the high country was suicide, that only fools and dead men ventured past the tree line. Apparently, Cade Mercer lived there. The wind picked up as they climbed, cutting through her coat like it was made of paper. Her hands went numb on the reins, her face felt frozen, but Cade never slowed, never looked back, just kept riding like the cold was nothing. Finally, as the sun started to sink toward the western peaks, he stopped. "There," he said, pointing. Elira followed his gaze and saw it, a cabin perched on a rocky outcrop, surrounded by towering pines. It wasn't large, maybe 3 rooms at most, but it looked solid. Smoke rose from the chimney, meaning someone had kept the fire going. "You have people working for you?" she asked. "No." "Then who?" "I set it before I left, timed the logs." She stared at him. "You timed your firewood?" "It's not complicated." They approached the cabin, and Elira could see more details now. The walls were thick timber, chinked with mud and moss. The roof was slate, heavy enough to hold under snow. There was a small barn attached to one side, and beyond that a smokehouse and what looked like a storage shed. Cade dismounted and led his horse to the barn. Elira followed, her legs stiff from the ride. Inside, the barn was surprisingly warm, heated by the horses already stabled there, 2 more besides Cade's black and her grey. "You care for your horse first," Cade said, not looking at her. "Always. Before you eat, before you warm up, before anything." "I know that." He glanced at her, something almost like surprise crossing his face. "Good." They worked in silence. Elira unsaddled the grey mare, rubbed her down with handfuls of straw, made sure she had water and feed. Her hands were clumsy from cold, but she managed. When she finished, Cade was already done with his own horse and was checking on the other 2. "They yours?" she asked. "One is. Other belonged to a trapper who died last winter. Couldn't let it starve." It was such a simple statement, delivered without emotion, but it told Elira more about Cade Mercer than anything else could have. He saved a dead man's horse, not because it was valuable, not because he needed it, just because letting it die would have been wrong. They left the barn and headed for the cabin. The door was heavy, reinforced with iron bands, and it scraped against the threshold when Cade pushed it open. Inside was warmer than Elira expected. The fire was burning low but steady, exactly as Cade had said. The main room was sparse, a table, 2 chairs, a bench near the fireplace, shelves lined with supplies. Everything was clean, organized, functional. No decorations, no personal touches, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived here versus just survived here. "You'll sleep there," Cade said, pointing to a door on the left. "That's your room." "My room? You think I'm making you sleep on the floor?" "I didn't." She stopped, unsure what she'd assumed. "Where do you sleep?" "Other room." He shrugged off his coat and hung it on a peg by the door. Beneath it, he wore a wool shirt that had seen better days, and Elira could see scars on his forearms where the sleeves were rolled up. "You're probably hungry." "I'm fine." "When's the last time you ate?" She didn't answer. Cade moved to the shelves and started pulling down supplies. Dried meat, hard biscuits, a jar of what looked like preserves. He worked efficiently, his movements economical and practiced. "Why did you choose me?" Elira asked suddenly. He didn't stop working. "Already told you, you'll figure it out." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting tonight." He set a plate on the table, loaded with more food than she usually saw in 3 days. "Eat, then get some sleep. We've got work tomorrow." "What kind of work?" "The kind that keeps us alive." He left her there, disappearing into his room and closing the door behind him. Elira stood in the main room, staring at the food, trying to make sense of what had just happened to her life. 6 hours ago, she'd been standing in Black Hollow's town square, the target of everyone's mockery. Now she was in a mountain cabin with a man she'd never spoken to before today, a man with a reputation for violence and solitude, a man who'd chosen her when nobody else would. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something else entirely, something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Hope. Egg. The next morning, Cade woke her before dawn. "Get dressed," he said through the door. "We're burning daylight." Elira dragged herself out of bed, an actual bed with a mattress and blankets that didn't smell like mildew, and pulled on her clothes. The room was small, but it had everything she needed: the bed, a wash basin, a trunk for storage, a single window that looked out over the forest. When she emerged, Cade was already dressed and waiting by the door. He handed her a cup of something hot and bitter. "Coffee," he said. "Drink it." She did, grimacing at the taste. Her father had drunk coffee sometimes when he could afford it, but she'd never developed a tolerance for it. "We're getting married today," Cade said, matter of fact. "There's a preacher in Black Hollow. We'll go down, get it done, come back. That's it?" "Were you expecting something else?" "I don't know, maybe." He looked at her for a long moment. "This isn't about romance, Elira. It's about survival. You understand that?" "Yes." "Good." He opened the door, letting in a blast of freezing air. "Let's go." The ride back to Black Hollow was even colder than the day before. The sky was grey, heavy with the promise of snow, and the wind cut through every layer Elira wore. But Cade kept a steady pace, never pushing too hard, always aware of where she was behind him. They reached Black Hollow by mid-morning. The settlement looked even more miserable in daylight. Buildings sagging under snow, people moving through the streets with their heads down and shoulders hunched. The preacher's house was on the north edge of town, a small structure that doubled as the closest thing Black Hollow had to a church. Cade knocked once, hard, and an old man answered, thin as a rail, with white hair and rheumy eyes. "Mercer," the preacher said, surprised. "Didn't expect to see you. Need to get married. Now?" "Now." The preacher looked at Elira, his expression unreadable. "This the woman from yesterday?" "Yes." "You sure about this?" "Third person who's asked me that answers the same. Yes." The preacher sighed. "Come inside then." The ceremony was brief and cold. The preacher read from a book so old the pages crumbled at the edges, stumbling over words he'd probably said 1,000 times. Cade and Elira stood before him, not touching, barely looking at each other. "Do you, Cade Mercer, take this woman?" "I do." "I haven't finished." "I do," Cade repeated. "Keep going." The preacher shot him an annoyed look but continued. "Do you, Elira Voss, take this man." "I do," she said quietly. "Then, by the authority granted to me by the territorial government and the grace of—" "We're married," Cade interrupted. "Where do we sign?" 5 minutes later, they were back outside. The entire thing had taken less time than saddling a horse. "That's it?" Elira asked as they walked back to where they'd left the horses. "What else do you want?" "I don't know. It just seemed... Listen." Cade stopped, turning to face her. "I'm not going to lie to you. Life on that mountain is hard. Harder than anything you've known in Black Hollow. The cold will try to kill you. The wolves will try to kill you. If you're not careful, I might accidentally kill you just because you don't know what you're doing. But I will never humiliate you. I will never mock you. And I will never make you feel like you're less than anyone else. That's more than most marriages have. Understand?" Elira nodded slowly. "I understand." "Good." He started walking again. "Now let's go home." "Home." The word settled into her chest like an ember, small and fragile but impossibly warm. Think. The days that followed blurred together into a rhythm Elira had never experienced before. Cade worked from dawn until well after dark, and he expected her to do the same. But he never gave her tasks she couldn't handle, and he always explained why something needed to be done. "The traps need checking every day," he told her on the third morning, leading her through the forest behind the cabin. "Wolves are smart. They'll learn the patterns if you're not careful." "How do you know where to set them?" "You look for signs. Tracks, scat, scratch marks on trees. Wolves are territorial. Once you know their territory, you know where they'll be." He showed her how to read the forest, how to distinguish wolf tracks from dog tracks, how to tell fresh kills from old ones, how to spot the subtle disturbances that meant predators were near. It was information she'd never imagined needing, but Cade taught her with patience that surprised her. "You're not stupid," he said once when she apologized for asking too many questions. "Ignorance and stupidity aren't the same thing. You ask questions, you learn, you get better. That's how it works." She also learned that Cade wasn't as solitary as everyone believed. Twice in the first week, other trappers stopped by. Rough men who looked like they'd been carved from the same stone as the mountains. They came for supplies or information, or sometimes just because Cade's cabin was the only safe place for 100 miles. One of them, a grizzled old trapper named Webb, actually laughed when he saw Elira. "So the rumors are true," he said, accepting a cup of coffee from Cade. "You really did marry the Voss girl. Problem with that?" Cade's voice was flat. Webb held up his hands. "No problem, just surprised is all. Didn't think you were the marrying type." "I'm not." "Then why? You want to trade or you want to gossip?" Webb smirked but dropped it. They spent an hour discussing trap lines and wolf sightings before he left, nodding to Elira as he passed. "Don't mind him," Cade said after Webb was gone. "He's an ass, but he's reliable." "Is that why you're friends with him?" "I'm not friends with anyone." "Then what would you call it?" Cade thought about that. Strategic alliances. Despite herself, Elira smiled. As the days turned into weeks, she began to understand the truth of what Cade had said. Life on the mountain was brutal. The cold was relentless. The work never stopped. But for the first time since her father died, Elira felt like she was doing something that mattered. She wasn't just surviving, she was learning, growing, becoming someone new. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of hauling firewood and repairing fence lines, they sat by the fire in silence. Cade was sharpening his knives, a task he performed with almost meditative focus. Elira watched him, working up the courage to ask the question that had been eating at her since that day in the square. "Why did you really choose me?" Cade didn't stop working. The whetstone scraped against steel, a rhythmic sound that filled the room. "You want the truth?" he asked finally. "Yes." He set down the knife and looked at her directly. "Because you were the only person in that square who wasn't performing." "What?" Everyone else was trying to look pretty or helpless or desirable, putting on a show for the men, but you just stood there dealing with it, taking whatever they threw at you without breaking. That's rare. That's valuable. You chose me because I can take abuse. I chose you because you're strong. He picked up the knife again. Most people don't know the difference between weakness and vulnerability. They see someone who gets hurt and they think that means they're weak. But staying kind in a place as cruel as Black Hollow, that takes more strength than anything else. I've known killers who couldn't do what you did. Elira didn't know what to say. No one had ever called her strong before. You still think this is pity? Cade asked. No, she said quietly, not anymore. Good. He went back to sharpening his knife, because we've got a lot of work ahead of us. It sank. The storm hit in the middle of the night. Elira woke to the sound of wind screaming past the cabin, so loud it sounded like something alive and furious. She stumbled out of bed, disoriented, and found Cade already awake and moving through the main room. Get dressed, he ordered. Heavy clothes. We've got to check the barn. What's wrong? Blizzard. Worst one I've seen in 5 years. He was pulling on his coat, wrapping a scarf around his face. The horses get scared. They'll kick the stalls apart. Then they freeze. They fought their way to the barn through wind that threatened to knock them off their feet. Snow came at them horizontally, blinding and vicious. By the time they reached the barn door, Elira couldn't feel her face. Inside, the horses were panicking. The black one was slamming against its stall, eyes rolling white with fear. The others weren't much better. Talk to them, Cade shouted over the wind. Keep them calm. Elira moved to the grey mare, the one she'd been riding, and laid a hand on its neck. The horse was trembling, nostrils flared. It's okay, she murmured. You're okay. Just breathe, just breathe. She didn't know if the horse understood, but her voice seemed to help. Slowly, the trembling eased. The mare lowered its head, pressing into Elira's hand. Across the barn, Cade was working on his black horse, checking the stall for damage, making sure everything was secure. He moved with complete confidence, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. They stayed in the barn for hours, keeping the horses calm while the storm raged outside. Somewhere around dawn, the wind finally started to ease. By the time they stumbled back to the cabin, exhausted and frozen, the worst had passed. Cade built up the fire while Elira collapsed onto the bench, too tired to care about propriety or appearances. You did good, he said, handing her a blanket. I didn't do anything. You kept your horse calm. That's everything. She pulled the blanket tighter. Does this happen a lot? Often enough. He sat down across from her. Welcome to winter in the high country. If this is winter, what's spring like? Mud, floods, starvation because nothing grows yet. He rubbed his face. You still think you made the right choice? Elira looked at him. This hard, scarred man who'd chosen her when no one else would, who'd taught her to survive, who'd never once treated her like she was anything less than capable. Yes, she said, I think I did. Something shifted in Cade's expression, not quite a smile, but close. Good, he said, because things are about to get worse. Worse how? He stood up, moving to the window. The storm had left behind a world buried in white, pristine, and deadly. Marshall's been making moves, Cade said quietly, trying to expand his territory. There's a reason I live up here instead of in town. What reason? This land used to be disputed territory. Government never figured out who owned it, so I claimed it, built this cabin, worked the trap lines, made it mine. But Gaines wants it, thinks he can push me off and take the whole mountain. Elira felt cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Can he do that? He can try. Cade turned to face her. That's what this marriage was really about, Elira. Not companionship, not romance. Strategy. If I die, you inherit the claim. Makes it harder for Gaines to seize the land. The words hit her like a physical blow. You married me so I could inherit your property if you die. Yes, that's insane. That's survival. His voice was completely level. You think I didn't know what I was doing? You think I didn't plan this? Then why? She stood up, anger flaring. Why tell me about strength? Why say all those things about choosing me? Because they're true. He didn't look away. I meant every word. You are strong, you are valuable, and yes, I chose you for strategic reasons, but that doesn't make the rest of it a lie. Elira wanted to scream, wanted to hit him, wanted to walk out that door and never come back. But she didn't, because despite everything, despite the cold calculation behind his choice, she believed him. If Gaines comes, she said slowly, what do? We fight. Just the two of us? If necessary. He moved away from the window. But I didn't bring you here to die, Elira. I brought you here to help me hold this land, and I think you can do it. You think I can fight the marshal? I think you can learn. The training started the next day. Cade handed her a rifle, older than she was, but well maintained. This is a Winchester, he said. 15 rounds. Lever action. You're going to learn how to load it, aim it, and shoot it until you can do it in your sleep. They spent hours in the clearing behind the cabin, Elira firing at targets while Cade critiqued her form. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, her ears rang despite the cloth she'd stuffed in them, but she kept shooting. Again, Cade said after she missed a shot, "You're pulling left. I'm trying." Trying isn't the same as doing. Focus, breathe, fire. She did, and this time the shot hit center mass. Better, he said, again. They also worked on traps. Cade showed her how to build snares from wire, how to dig pit traps and disguise them, how to create obstacles that could slow or stop pursuers. Think like prey, he told her one afternoon as they worked. You're smaller, weaker, slower, so you don't fight fair. You use the terrain, you set up ambushes, you make them come to you on your terms. You really think it'll come to that? I know it will. The certainty in his voice frightened her, but it also made her determined. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of training, Webb showed up again. This time he looked worried. You heard? He asked Cade, not bothering with pleasantries. Heard what? Gaines has been recruiting, bringing in guns from outside the territory. Word is he's planning a move before spring thaw. Cade's expression didn't change. How many? Dozen, maybe 15, more than you can handle alone. I'm not alone. Webb glanced at Elira, doubt written all over his face. No offense, Mrs. Mercer, but none taken, she said coolly, but I'm learning. Learning doesn't stop bullets. Neither does running, Cade said. You offering to help? Webb hesitated. I can spread the word. Some of the other trappers, they don't like Gaines either. Might be willing to stand with you. Might isn't the same as will. It's the best you're going to get. After Webb left, Elira found Cade standing outside, staring at the mountains silhouetted against the sunset. We're going to die, aren't we? She asked quietly. Probably. That doesn't scare you. He was silent for a long moment. I've been living on borrowed time since I came to this territory. Every winter I survive is a gift. Every raid I walk away from is luck. I stopped being scared years ago. I'm scared. Good. He finally looked at her. Fear keeps you sharp. Just don't let it freeze you. What if I can't do this? You can. You already have. He turned back to the mountains. You stood in that town square while they laughed at you and you didn't break. That's harder than anything Gaines can throw at us. Elira wasn't sure she believed him, but she wanted to. Winter deepened. The snow piled higher against the cabin walls. The temperature dropped until breathing hurt, and every day Elira trained. She learned to shoot in darkness, in wind, in conditions that would have sent her running just weeks before. She learned to build fires that gave off heat but no smoke, to move through snow without leaving obvious tracks, to read the sky and predict when storms were coming. Cade taught her all of it with relentless patience, never accepting less than her best, but never making her feel like she was failing. You're getting better, he said one morning after she'd hit 5 targets in a row. I'm still slow. Slow beats dead. She lowered the rifle. Do you ever regret this? Choosing me? No, not even a little. He looked at her directly. You're alive, you're learning, you haven't quit. That's more than most people can say. So no, no regrets. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. That night, lying in bed and listening to the wind howl, Elira realized something that should have terrified her, but instead felt like a revelation. She didn't want to leave, not because she was trapped, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because for the first time in her life she felt like she mattered, like she was building something, like she was becoming someone. The woman nobody wanted in Black Hollow was dead, and whoever Elira Voss was becoming on this mountain, cold, hard, capable, that woman was going to survive, no matter what it took. The thaw came early that year, which meant trouble. Elira stood at the edge of the clearing, watching water drip from the eaves of the cabin in a steady rhythm that felt almost hypnotic. 2 months had passed since the wedding, 2 months of brutal training and harder lessons, and she barely recognized the woman she'd become. Her hands were calloused now, scarred from rope burns and knife work. Her shoulders had broadened from hauling wood and water. Even her face looked different, sharper, leaner, with something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Cade emerged from the barn, carrying an armload of traps that needed repair. He'd been quieter than usual the past few days, which meant he was thinking, planning, preparing for something he hadn't told her about yet. "How many?" she asked without preamble. He didn't pretend not to understand. "Webb says 15 confirmed, maybe more." "When?" "Soon. Gaines won't wait for full thaw. Too much mud, too many places for us to disappear." He set the traps down on the workbench they'd built outside. "He'll come while there's still snow on the ground, but the passes are clear enough to move men and supplies." Elira picked up one of the traps, examining the mechanism. It was a leg-hold design, vicious and efficient. "We can't fight 15 men." "No, we can't." Cade pulled out his knife and started working on a frozen joint. "So we won't fight them. We'll make them fight the mountain." Meaning we turn this valley into a kill box. Traps on every approach, obstacles in the passes, ambush points where one person can hold off 10. He looked up at her. "You remember what I taught you about terrain? Use it or die by it." "Exactly." He went back to work. "Gaines thinks he's bringing enough men to overwhelm us, but numbers don't mean much when you're walking through a valley that's actively trying to kill you." The plan was insane, suicidal even, but as Elira listened to Cade explain it, the trap placements, the fallback positions, the ways they could use the forest and the snow and the mountain itself as weapons, she realized something that should have terrified her. She believed they could do it. Not because they were stronger or better armed or luckier than Gaines and his men, but because they understood this land in ways those men never would, because they'd spent months learning how to survive here, how to read the mountain's moods, how to exist in a place that killed careless people without remorse. "We'll need help," she said finally. "Maybe." Cade didn't sound convinced. Webb said he talked to the other trappers, but most of them won't risk going against Gaines. He controls the supply routes, the trade permits, everything that keeps them alive. "So we do it alone, if necessary." Elira set down the trap. "I'm not going to die easy." Cade looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, something almost like a smile crossed his face. "I know you won't." They worked through the morning, repairing traps and checking supplies. Around noon, they heard hoofbeats approaching. 3 riders coming up the trail at a pace that suggested urgency rather than leisure. Cade's hand went to his rifle, but he relaxed slightly when he recognized the lead rider. Webb, along with 2 other trappers Elira had met in passing. One was a young man named Keller, barely 20, with a scar across his jaw from a wolf attack. The other was older, weather-beaten, called Moss, because nobody remembered his real name anymore. "You came," Cade said as they dismounted. As Webb spat into the snow. "Don't make it sound like sentiment. This is strategy. Gaines takes your land. He'll come for ours next. Better to stop him here. Just the 3 of you." 4 others said maybe. "That means no." Webb looked around the clearing, taking in the defensive preparations already underway. "You really think you can hold this place?" I think we don't have a choice. Moss spoke up, his voice like gravel. Heard Gaines brought in some serious guns, not just local muscle. Professional killers from the eastern settlements. Good, Cade said flatly. Professional means predictable. They'll come at us the way they've been trained. We just need to make sure that training gets them killed. Keller, who'd been silent until now, cleared his throat. Mom, no offense, but can you actually shoot? Elira walked to where her rifle leaned against the cabin wall, picked it up, and fired 3 times in rapid succession. 3 pine cones exploded off branches 50 yards away. Any other questions? She asked, not bothering to hide her irritation. Keller held up his hands. No, ma'am, just asking. Stop asking stupid questions and start being useful, Cade said. We've got traps to place and not much time to do it. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, spreading out across the valley to set their defenses. Elira worked alongside Moss, who turned out to be surprisingly good at reading terrain. You've changed, he said as they dug a pit for a covered trap. Heard about you in town, what they used to say. I know what they said. Well, they were wrong. He tested the depth of the pit with a long stick. You got sand, most people don't, they just got noise. It was the closest thing to a compliment Elira had received from anyone except Cade, and it meant more than it should have. That night, the 6 of them gathered in Cade's cabin around the fireplace. It was crowded and uncomfortable, but nobody complained. Webb had brought whiskey, which they passed around while Cade sketched out the valley on a piece of bark with a charred stick. 3 main approaches, he explained. North Pass is the easiest route, which means they'll probably send their main force that way. We'll let them think it's undefended, let them commit, then hit them from the sides while they're bunched up in the narrows. What about the East Trail? Keller asked. Too steep for a full assault, but they might send scouts. We'll put traps there, tripwires, snares, maybe some deadfalls if we have time. And the South? That's where we make our stand if everything else fails. It's the most defensible position, but it's also our last resort. If we're fighting there, it means they've pushed us back, and we're one mistake from being overrun. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed that reality. How many of us, you think, walk away from this? Webb asked quietly. Cade looked at him. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe all of us, maybe none. But I know this, we make them pay for every inch. We make them regret coming here. And if we're lucky, we make them scared enough that nobody else tries it again. Hell of a plan, Moss muttered. You got a better one? No. They drank in silence after that, each person alone with their thoughts. Elira found herself studying the men around the fire, rough, hard men, who'd chosen to stand with them despite knowing the odds. Men who could have walked away but didn't. Cade caught her eye and gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of what she was thinking. These weren't friends, they weren't even allies in any traditional sense, but they were here, and that counted for something. When the others had bedded down for the night, Webb and Moss in the barn, Keller wrapped in blankets by the fire, Elira found Cade standing outside, staring at the stars. Can't sleep, she asked. Never can before something like this. Something like what? You've done this before? Not exactly, but close enough. He was quiet for a moment. I was with the army for a while, before I came here. Spent 2 years fighting raiders on the southern frontier. It was the most personal information he'd ever volunteered. Elira moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel his warmth in the cold night air. Why did you leave? Because I killed enough people to know I was good at it. And that scared me more than dying did. His breath steamed in the darkness. So I came here. Figured I'd live alone, hurt nobody, die quiet. Then Gaines started making his moves, and I realized there's no such thing as staying out of it. Violence finds you whether you want it or not. I'm sorry. Don't be. I made my choices. He glanced at her. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who'd need protecting. Someone soft. He shook his head. But you're not soft. You're steel wrapped in flesh. You just didn't know it until you had to be. Elira felt something shift in her chest, something warm and dangerous. "Cade, don't," he said quietly. "Don't say whatever you're about to say. Not tonight. Not with what's coming." "Why not?" "Because if we both die tomorrow, I don't want the last thing between us to be something we didn't mean or didn't have time to mean properly." It was the most vulnerable thing she'd ever heard him say, and it broke something open inside her. "Then promise me something," she said. "What?" "If we survive this, you'll say it yourself, whatever you're not letting me say now." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with something, some wall he'd built years ago to keep himself separate from caring about anything. "All right," he said finally. "If we survive." They stood there together in the cold, not touching but close, until finally Cade went inside and Elira followed. Tomorrow, Marshal Gaines would come. Tomorrow everything would change, but tonight, for just a few hours, they had peace. The attack came 3 days later, just before dawn. Elira was checking the traps on the eastern approach when she heard it, the distant sound of horses and men trying to move quietly through snow. She counted footsteps, estimated numbers, then ran back to the cabin as fast as the terrain allowed. Cade was already awake, rifle in hand. "How many?" "Dozen on the east side, maybe more elsewhere." "They're splitting their forces." He moved to the window, scanning the forest. "Smarter than I expected." Webb burst in from the barn, breathing hard. "North Pass has got movement. Looks like 6 or 7. "That's 18 confirmed," Moss said, appearing behind Webb. "Where's the rest?" "Probably south, trying to cut off our retreat." Cade grabbed his coat. "Everyone to positions. Remember the plan. Let them commit before you fire." They scattered. Elira took up position on the eastern approach, crouched behind a fallen log that gave her cover and a clear line of sight. Keller was somewhere to her left, hidden in the rocks. The trappers had insisted she shouldn't be alone, but Cade had overruled them. She'd earned her position. The wait was agony. Elira could hear them coming, the crunch of snow, the occasional muttered curse, the sound of men who thought they were being quiet but weren't. Her hands were steady on the rifle despite her racing heart. She'd trained for this, practiced until loading and firing was as natural as breathing. The first man appeared through the trees, moving cautiously, rifle raised. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with a thin beard and eyes that scanned the forest nervously. Behind him came another, then another. Elira waited. Let them get closer. Let them think they were safe. The lead man stepped directly on one of her trap triggers. The snare yanked him off his feet and hauled him 10 feet into the air, where he hung upside down, screaming and thrashing. His rifle discharged, the shot going wild. His companions froze, trying to understand what had just happened. That's when Elira fired. Her first shot took the second man in the shoulder, spinning him around. Her second missed. Her third caught another man in the leg, and he went down hard. The remaining men scattered, looking for cover, returning fire. Bullets tore through branches around Elira, but she was already moving, relocating to a secondary position like Cade had taught her. Never stay static. Never give them a target. From somewhere to the north, she heard heavier gunfire. Cade and Webb engaging the main force. From the west, single precise shots that had to be Moss. The battle had begun. Elira moved through the forest like a ghost, using every trick Cade had taught her. She fired, relocated, fired again. The men hunting her were professionals, but they were fighting on unfamiliar ground against an enemy they couldn't see. Every step was a potential trap. Every shadow could hide death. One of them got smart and tried to flank her. She heard him coming. He was trying to be quiet, but his breathing gave him away. She waited until he was 3 feet from her position, then stood up and fired point blank into his chest. He went down without a sound. Elira stood there for a moment, staring at what she'd done. She'd killed a man, actually killed him. The reality of it hit her like a physical blow. Then bullets started flying again, and she stopped thinking about it, stopped feeling anything except the cold clarity of survival. She moved back toward the cabin, picking off targets when she had clear shots, forcing the attackers to stay scattered and disorganized. Somewhere in the chaos, she heard someone screaming for a retreat. By the time she reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was fully up, and the attack had broken apart into running battles across the valley. Cade was on the cabin roof, firing down at men trying to approach from the north. Webb was behind the barn, wounded but still fighting. Moss was nowhere to be seen. Elira sprinted across open ground, feeling bullets snap past her, and dove behind the woodpile. A man appeared from her left, and she shot him without hesitation. Another came from the right, and she shot him too. This wasn't war, it was slaughter, and she was good at it. That realization should have horrified her. Instead, it felt like waking up, like finding a part of herself she'd never known existed. She was still firing when she heard the horn, 3 long blasts echoing across the valley, a retreat signal. The surviving attackers pulled back, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead behind. Within minutes, the forest was empty except for the bodies and the blood and the silence. Elira stayed behind cover, not trusting it. Cade climbed down from the roof, moving carefully, checking every angle. "Keller," he called out. "Here." The young man emerged from the rocks, covered in snow and blood. "I'm hit, but not bad." "Moss?" Silence. Webb limped out from behind the barn. Saw him go down near the south pass. He was covering our flank when they tried to circle around. Cade's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. "He buy us time?" "Yeah, long enough for me to collapse the pass. They won't be coming that way again." Then he did his job. Cade turned to Elira. "You all right?" She looked down at herself, covered in snow, dirt, blood that might have been hers or might not. "I don't know, maybe." "Did you freeze up?" "No." "Did you run?" "No." "Then you're all right." He walked toward the edge of the clearing, scanning the forest. "They'll regroup, come at us again, maybe today, maybe tomorrow." "We held them," Webb said. "That's got to count for something." "It counts for them knowing we're not an easy target, but it also means they'll come back harder." Cade kicked at the snow. "We hurt them today. Tomorrow they'll want revenge." Elira moved to stand beside him, and this time she did touch him, just her hand on his arm. But it was enough. He looked at her, and something passed between them, something beyond words. "I killed 3 men," she said quietly. "Maybe 4, I'm not sure. I know. I should feel something, guilt, horror, something, but you don't." "No, I just feel tired." Cade nodded slowly. "That's how you know you'll survive this. The ones who cry, who break down, who can't pull the trigger the second time, they're already dead. But you did what needed doing, and you're still standing. That's what matters." "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "It's supposed to keep you alive." They spent the rest of the day fortifying their positions and treating wounds. Keller had taken a bullet through the meat of his thigh, but he'd survive. Webb's injuries were worse, a deep gash across his ribs, and what might have been a broken arm. But he refused to leave. "I came here to fight," he said, when Cade suggested he head back to his own cabin. "Fight's not over. Fight's not." They burned the bodies of the men who'd attacked them, not out of respect, but because leaving corpses around was a good way to attract wolves and disease. Elira helped with the grim work, dragging bodies to the pyre, trying not to look at their faces. One of them was the young man with the thin beard, the first one she'd seen. He couldn't have been more than 25. Probably had people who cared about him. Probably thought he was doing the right thing, following orders, earning his pay. Now he was just meat for the fire. That night they took turns on watch. When it was Elira's turn, she sat by the window with her rifle across her knees, staring out at the darkness and wondering who she'd become. The woman who'd stood in Black Hollow's town square would never have killed anyone. That woman had been soft, afraid, desperate to avoid conflict at any cost. But that woman was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who could pull a trigger without hesitation, someone who could watch men die and feel nothing except relief that she was the one still breathing. Cade had called it survival. Maybe he was right, but it felt like something else, something that couldn't be taken back. When her watch ended and Keller took over, she went to her room but couldn't sleep. Finally, she got up and found Cade in his room, also awake, cleaning his rifle by candlelight. "Can I come in?" she asked. He nodded. She sat on the edge of his bed, suddenly unsure what she'd come to say. "I keep seeing them," she said finally, "the men I shot. I close my eyes and they're there. That'll pass." "Will it? Or am I just going to get used to it? Does it matter?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't know. Maybe not." Cade set down his rifle. "You want me to tell you it's going to be okay? That you're still a good person despite what you did? I can't. Because I don't know if either of those things is true. What I do know is that you're alive because you were willing to do what needed doing. And tomorrow, you're going to have to do it again. And the day after that depends on whether we win." Elira laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "We're talking about survival like it's inevitable, but we could just die. Probably will die." "Yeah," Cade agreed. "Probably. Doesn't that scare you?" "Not as much as living with regrets does." He looked at her directly. "I've done things I'm not proud of. Killed people who maybe didn't deserve it. Walked away from fights I should have stayed for. But I don't regret choosing you. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and impossibly heavy. "I don't regret it either," Elira said. "Any of it." They sat in silence after that, not touching, just existing together in the candlelight, while outside the wind howled and the mountains settled into darkness. Tomorrow would bring more violence, more blood, more death. But tonight they had this moment, and for now that was enough. The second attack came at noon the next day, and it was worse than the first. This time, Gaines sent his entire force, more than 20 men, all heavily armed, moving in coordinated groups. They'd learned from the first assault. They moved carefully, checking for traps, covering each other's advances. Elira was on the roof with Cade when the first shots rang out. She could see them coming through the trees, spread out in a skirmish line that made them harder to target. "They brought more men," she said. "Or the ones who ran yesterday came back with friends." Cade sighted down his rifle. "Doesn't matter. Same plan. Make them bleed for every foot." The battle was more brutal this time. The attackers pressed harder, willing to take casualties to gain ground. Webb went down early, taking a bullet through the leg that shattered bone. Keller dragged him behind cover and tried to stop the bleeding while still returning fire. Elira lost count of how many shots she fired. Her world narrowed to target acquisition and trigger pull. See the enemy, aim, fire, find new position, repeat. She moved across the roof like smoke, never staying still, making herself impossible to pin down. Below, Cade fought with cold precision. Every shot counted. Every bullet found flesh. But there were too many. An explosion rocked the clearing as someone threw dynamite. The blast took out part of the barn wall and started a fire. Smoke billowed into the air, thick and choking. "Fall back," Cade shouted. "Everyone to the cabin." They retreated in stages, covering each other, making the attackers pay for every inch of ground. By the time they barricaded themselves inside the cabin, half the clearing was on fire and bodies littered the snow. "How many rounds left?" Cade asked, checking his ammunition. "Maybe 30, Elira said. 20, Keller reported. Webb was unconscious, bleeding out despite their efforts to stop it. His breathing was shallow and ragged. "He's not going to make it," Keller said quietly. "I know." Cade moved to the window, peering out. They're regrouping, getting ready for a final push. "We can't hold," Elira said. It wasn't a question. "No, we can't." He turned to face them. "But we can make them remember this. Make them understand that taking this mountain costs more than it's worth." "How?" Keller asked. Cade smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Elira had ever seen on a human face. "We burn it all down," he explained quickly. They had oil stores for lamps. They had alcohol. They had enough flammable material to turn the entire valley into an inferno. "We set the traps we couldn't use," he said. "Rig the cabin to blow. Lead them into the forest and burn everything behind us. They want this land. They can have the ashes." "That's insane," Keller said. "You got a better idea?" Nobody did. They worked fast, pouring oil along the cabin walls, setting charges, preparing for the kind of destruction that couldn't be undone. Webb died while they worked, slipping away without waking. They didn't have time to mourn. When everything was ready, Cade looked at Elira. "You ready for this?" She thought about the woman she'd been, the one who'd stood in the square and taken their mockery without fighting back, the one who'd believed herself worthless because everyone else said she was. That woman was gone, burned away by cold and blood and the simple act of refusing to die. "Yeah," Elira said, "I'm ready." They left through the back window as the attackers stormed the front. Cade triggered the charges remotely, a trick he'd learned in the army, and the cabin erupted in flames behind them. The explosion was massive, taking out everyone who'd breached the walls and setting fire to everything within 50 yards. They ran through the burning forest, Cade in the lead and Elira and Keller following. Behind them, the valley had become hell, fire and smoke and screaming men. They made it to the South Pass just as the entire clearing collapsed in on itself, the flames finally reaching the ammunition stores they deliberately left behind. The second explosion was even bigger than the first. When the smoke finally cleared, there was nothing left but ash and char and the broken bodies of men who'd made the mistake of underestimating what desperation could accomplish. Marshal Gaines himself was among the dead, caught in the initial blast, killed instantly. The few survivors fled back to Black Hollow, spreading stories about the devil woman on the mountain who'd burned an entire valley to hold her ground. Elira Voss stood at the edge of the devastation, covered in soot and blood, and felt absolutely nothing. She'd won, but the cost was everything she'd built. The ash took 3 days to cool enough that they could walk through it without burning their boots. Elira stood at what used to be the edge of the cabin's foundation, staring at blackened timber and melted metal. Everything they'd built was gone. The cabin, the barn, the storage sheds, reduced to carbon and memory. Even the trees surrounding the clearing were skeletal remains, charred black and stripped of bark. Cade crouched nearby, sifting through debris with a stick. He hadn't spoken much since the explosion, neither had she. What was there to say? They'd survived, but survival felt hollow when you were standing in the ruins of everything you'd fought for. Keller had left that morning, heading back to his own trap lines, with promises to return if they needed help rebuilding. But his eyes had said what his mouth wouldn't. He thought they were finished, that the mountain had finally beaten them. "Found the strong box," Cade said, his voice rough from smoke inhalation. He pulled a metal container from the wreckage, dented and blackened, but intact. Inside were the land deeds, some coins, a few personal items that had survived by sheer luck. "That's something," Elira said, though she wasn't sure she meant it. "It's enough to start over." He stood, tucking the box under his arm. "Question is whether we want to." She looked at him sharply. "You're thinking about leaving?" "I'm thinking about options. This land cost us everything. Moss is dead. Webb's dead. We killed 24 men and burned down everything we built. For what? A piece of paper that says we own a valley full of ash? You told me this land mattered, that holding it meant something. It did, then." He gestured at the devastation. "Now I'm not so sure." Elira felt anger flare, hot and sudden. "So we just give up? Let Gaines win even though he's dead?" Gaines lost. His men lost. Everyone who thought they could take this mountain by force lost. Cade's voice was flat, exhausted. "But maybe winning looks different than we thought. Maybe it's knowing when to walk away." "I don't want to walk away." "Why not?" She didn't have an answer ready. Or maybe she did and just didn't want to say it out loud. That walking away meant becoming that woman from the town square again. The one who took whatever the world gave her and never fought back. The one who believed she deserved nothing better. "Because I'm not done yet," she said finally. Cade studied her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression, some weight lifting. All right. Then we rebuild. Just like that? Just like that. He looked around the clearing, and for the first time since the battle, she saw something besides defeat in his eyes. We've got time before winter. Enough to get a basic structure up, enough to survive. Won't be comfortable, but we've survived worse. Where do we even start? Same place we always start, with what we have. He opened the strongbox and pulled out a few coins. We ride to Black Hollow, buy supplies, let everyone see we're still alive. They'll try to run us out. Maybe, or maybe they'll realize that the people who killed Marshal Gaines aren't the ones you want as enemies. He closed the box. Either way, we need to know where we stand. They rode down the mountain 2 days later, following trails that were just starting to thaw into mud. The journey took longer than usual because they were leading a pack horse and because Cade insisted on checking every approach for ambushes. He didn't think Gaines's remaining men would regroup, but he didn't trust assumptions either. Black Hollow looked different than Elira remembered. Smaller somehow, less threatening. The buildings were still crooked, the streets still half-frozen mud, but the town itself seemed diminished, like someone had let the air out of it. People stopped to stare as they rode through. Conversations died mid-sentence. A woman grabbed her child and pulled him inside. The blacksmith actually crossed himself, which would have been funny if the fear in his eyes hadn't been so genuine. "They're scared," Elira said quietly. "Good," Cade replied. "Fear keeps people honest." They tied their horses outside Harkin's general store. The old man was behind his counter as always, but his hands shook as he counted coins. "Mercer," he said, his voice cracking. "Didn't expect to see you." "Need supplies," Cade said, pulling out a list. "Timber, nails, canvas, dried food, whatever you've got." Harkin stared at the list. "That's a lot of material. Can you provide it or not?" "I can, but..." He looked at Elira, then back at Cade. "People are saying things about what happened up there, about the marshal and his men." "What people say doesn't concern me," Cade replied. "What concerns me is whether you're refusing to sell." "I'm not refusing, just there's talk about bringing in the territorial authorities, about charges." Cade leaned across the counter, not threatening exactly, but close enough. "Let me be clear about something. Gaines came to my land with armed men. He tried to kill us and take what was ours. We defended ourselves. If the territorial government has a problem with that, they can come talk to me directly. But if they send more men with guns, those men are going to end up just as dead as Gaines did. You understand what I'm saying?" Harkin swallowed hard. "I understand." "Good. Now about those supplies." While Cade handled the transaction, Elira wandered toward the back of the store. She could feel eyes on her, people watching through windows, tracking her movement, like she was some kind of wild animal that had wandered into town. She found Clara there, the woman who'd stood beside her in the square that day. Clara looked older now, worn down by whatever life she'd found with the rancher who'd chosen her. "Elira," Clara said, surprise evident in her voice. "I heard you were dead." "Not yet." "They're saying you killed 30 men, burned the whole mountain." "Not the whole mountain, just the parts that needed burning." Clara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Is it true, what they're saying about you and Mercer, that you fought off the marshal's entire force?" "Most of it's probably exaggeration, but some of it's true." Elira met her eyes. "Some of it." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said something Elira didn't expect. I'm glad you survived. I'm glad you made them pay." "Why?" "Because someone needed to. Because Gaines was a bastard who did whatever he wanted and nobody could stop him. Because..." She trailed off, looking away. "Because maybe if I'd been braver, I could have been like you instead of like this." "Clara, Don't say it's not too late or that I can still change things. We both know that's not true." She picked up a sack of flour, testing its weight. "But I can help you, if you need it. Information, supplies, whatever. Consider it my way of doing something that matters." Before Elira could respond, the door crashed open and 3 men entered. They were armed, carrying rifles, and they moved with the kind of authority that came from wearing badges. territorial lawmen. Cade Mercer, the lead one, said. He was tall, thin, with a face like weathered leather. You're under arrest for murder and destruction of property. Cade didn't move from where he stood. On whose authority? Territorial governor. We've got writs. The lawman pulled papers from his coat. Says here you killed Marshal Gaines and 20 of his deputies during an unprovoked attack. Unprovoked. Cade's voice was dangerously quiet. Gaines came to my land with armed men, trying to force me off. That's not unprovoked. That's called defending your property. That's not how the writs read. Then the writs are wrong. The lawmen spread out surrounding Cade. Elira's hand moved toward her rifle before she even realized she was doing it. Don't, the lead lawman said, looking at her. We're not here for you, Mrs. Mercer. Just your husband. He's not going anywhere, Elira said. Mom, this doesn't concern you. Like hell it doesn't. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Everyone was armed. Everyone was scared. One wrong move and the general store was going to become a slaughterhouse. Then Harkin spoke up from behind his counter, his voice shaking but determined. The marshal came here 3 months ago, said he was expanding territorial control, started demanding taxes, controlling trade routes, forcing people to sell their land cheap. Anyone who refused got threatened. Some got worse than threatened. The lead lawman frowned. What are you saying, old man? I'm saying Gaines was a thug with a badge, and if Mercer killed him, then Mercer did us all a favor. Harkin looked around at the other townspeople who'd gathered at the windows and doorway. You want to know what really happened? Ask anyone here. They'll tell you. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. People started speaking up, adding their own stories about Gaines's corruption, his brutality, the way he'd run Black Hollow like his personal kingdom. The lawmen looked at each other, uncertainty replacing their earlier confidence. We still have the writs, the lead one said, but his voice had lost its edge. Then go back to the territorial capital and tell them the truth, Cade said. Tell them Gaines wasn't a marshal, he was a criminal. And tell them if they send more men to finish what he started, those men won't be coming back either. The standoff lasted another 30 seconds that felt like hours. Finally, the lead lawman folded the writs and put them back in his coat. We'll be filing a report, he said. Someone will come investigate properly. Looking forward to it, Cade replied. The lawman left, and the tension drained out of the room like water from a cracked bucket. Harkin let out a breath he'd been holding and went back to tallying supplies. You made enemies today, he said to Cade. I've had worse. Maybe, but the territorial government doesn't forget. They'll send someone else, someone smarter than those three. Let them. Cade picked up the first crate of supplies. I'm not afraid of bureaucrats. They loaded the pack horse and left Black Hollow, riding back up the mountain as the sun climbed toward noon. Nobody stopped them. Nobody said goodbye. But Elira could feel eyes tracking them all the way to the tree line. That could have gone worse, she said once they were clear of town. It's not over. Harkin's right. They'll send investigators, maybe even federal marshals if they think there's enough cause. So we just wait? We rebuild. If they come, they come. He adjusted his grip on the reins, but we make sure we're ready. The ride back was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they finally reached the clearing, the devastation looked even worse in afternoon light. But Cade had been right about one thing. They had enough to start over. They spent the next week clearing debris and salvaging what they could. Nails that hadn't melted. Tools that had survived in the barn's underground storage. Sections of timber that were charred but still structurally sound. It was hard physical work that left them exhausted by nightfall. They slept in a makeshift tent near where the cabin had stood, too tired to do more than eat and collapse. But slowly, painfully, the site began to transform from disaster zone to building project. Other trappers started showing up. Word had spread about what happened, and apparently defending your land against corrupt lawmen meant something in the frontier. They came in twos and threes, bringing supplies, offering labor, saying little but helping much. A trapper named Quinn showed up with a wagon full of cut logs. "Heard you could use these," was all he said before unloading and leaving. 2 brothers from the eastern valleys arrived with tools and stayed for 3 days, helping frame out the new cabin's foundation. Even Webb's widow came, bringing food and blankets. She looked at Elira with eyes that held no blame, only understanding. "He knew what he was fighting for," she said. "Don't waste his death by giving up." Elira promised she wouldn't. By the end of the 3rd week they had walls, basic, rough but standing. The structure was smaller than the original cabin, more defensible, with gun ports built into the walls and a reinforced door. This wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. They were working on the roof when Keller returned, bringing news that made Elira's stomach drop. "Territorial governor is sending a commission," he said, dismounting. "Official investigation into what happened with Gaines. They'll be here in 2 weeks." Cade hammered in another nail before responding. "How many?" 6 men. Investigators, lawyers, that type. But they're bringing guards too, maybe a dozen soldiers. Armed? Yeah, but they're saying it's protective, not offensive. They just want to ask questions. "Questions with armed backup," Elira said. "That doesn't sound protective." "It doesn't," Cade agreed. "But we don't have much choice. We refuse to talk to them. They'll assume we're guilty. We cooperate. Maybe we get them to see things our way." "You really believe that?" "No, but it's better than starting another war." The next 2 weeks were spent preparing. Not for battle this time, but for something potentially more dangerous. Politics. Cade gathered statements from everyone who'd witnessed Gaines's corruption. Elira wrote out a detailed account of the attack, the defense, everything that had happened. They assembled documents proving the land was legally theirs, that they'd done everything by the book. The commission arrived on a cold morning in late spring. 6 men in suits that looked absurd in the wilderness, accompanied by 12 territorial soldiers who looked far more comfortable. They rode into the clearing and stared at the burned remains and the new cabin rising from the ashes. The lead investigator was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses named Hendricks. He dismounted carefully, like he wasn't sure if the ground would hold him. "Mr. Mercer," he said, offering a hand that Cade didn't take. "Thank you for meeting with us." "Didn't have much choice." "No, I suppose not." Hendricks looked around, taking in the destruction. "Quite a battle you had here." "Wasn't a battle, it was an invasion." "That's a matter of perspective, which is why we're here to investigate." He pulled out a notebook. "Perhaps we should start with your account of events." They spent 3 days going over every detail. The investigators were thorough, asking the same questions in different ways, trying to catch inconsistencies. They interviewed Keller. They talked to trappers who'd witnessed Gaines's corruption. They examined the physical evidence. Elira watched it all with growing frustration. These were men who lived in cities, who made decisions from behind desks, who'd never had to fight for their lives or defend their homes. What did they know about survival on the frontier? On the 3rd night, Hendrik sat across from her and Cade at their rough table in the new cabin. "I'll be honest with you," he said, setting down his notebook. "The evidence supports your version of events. Gaines exceeded his authority, likely was engaged in criminal activity, and initiated the conflict that led to his death. By all legal standards, you were within your rights to defend yourselves." "Then we're clear," Cade said. "Not quite." Hendricks removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief. "The problem isn't what you did, it's what you represent. You killed a territorial marshal and 24 men. Whether or not it was justified, that creates a precedent the government can't ignore. If we let this stand without consequences, every frontier settler with a grievance is going to think they can solve their problems with violence." "So this is about politics," Elira said. "Everything is about politics, Mrs. Mercer. The question is what form those politics take." He put his glasses back on. "The territorial governor wants a resolution that maintains order without punishing people who were clearly defending themselves. So here's what I'm prepared to offer. He laid out the proposal. Cade and Elira would face no criminal charges. Their land claim would be recognized and protected. In exchange, Cade would serve as an unofficial liaison between the territorial government and the frontier settlements, helping maintain order and reporting on criminal activity. You want me to be a lawman, Cade said flatly. I want you to be what you already are, someone who understands this territory and commands respect. You wouldn't have formal authority, but you'd have the government's backing. And if I refuse, then the investigation continues. We look harder at everything that happened. We find things that maybe don't look quite so defensible. We make your life difficult. Hendrik spread his hands. I'm not threatening you, Mr. Mercer. I'm explaining reality. The government needs a win here. You can be that win, or you can be an example of what happens when citizens take law into their own hands. Cade looked at Elira. She could see him weighing options, calculating odds. Finally, he turned back to Hendricks. I'll do it, he said, but on one condition. My wife is part of this. Anything you ask me to do, she does too. Any backing you give me, she gets the same. She's not my assistant or my helper. She's my partner. Hendricks looked at Elira like he was seeing her for the first time. That's unusual. I don't care. Those are my terms. After a long moment, Hendricks nodded. Very well. Partnership it is. They signed papers that night, making it official. By morning, the commission was packing up to leave, satisfied they'd achieved their political objective. Before they rode out, Hendricks pulled Elira aside. Can I ask you something? He said. What's it like, being the woman who burned down a valley to hold her ground? Elira thought about that question, about everything she'd lost and everything she'd become, about the bodies in the snow and the ash in the clearing, and the way she could pull a trigger now without hesitation. It's like being alive, she said finally. For the first time in my life. Hendricks nodded slowly. I think I understand. Good luck, Mrs. Mercer. Something tells me you're going to need it. After the commission left, Elira and Cade stood in the clearing, watching the dust settle from their departure. You didn't have to do that, she said. Make me part of the deal. Yes, I did. You earned it. He looked at her. You're not the woman from the town square anymore. Haven't been for a while. It's time everyone else recognized that. What am I then? Someone who survived when she wasn't supposed to. Someone who learned to fight when nobody thought she could. Someone who stood in the fire and didn't burn. He paused. Someone I'm glad is standing beside me. It was the closest he'd come to saying what he'd promised to say if they survived. And maybe it was enough. They finished the cabin over the next month. It wasn't as large as the original, but it was solid, defensible, and it was theirs. The territory around the clearing slowly came back to life as spring truly arrived. New grass pushed through the ash. Wildflowers bloomed in unexpected places. The forest began to heal. Word spread about Cade's new position, and with it came requests for help. Disputes between trappers, reports of raiders, questions about land claims. He handled them all with the same efficiency he'd used to defend his mountain, and Elira was there for everyone. People started calling her by a name she hadn't chosen, but couldn't quite reject. The Iron Woman. They said it with a mixture of fear and respect. Some told stories about her that weren't true, about how she'd killed 50 men single-handedly, about how she could track a wolf through solid rock, about how she never missed a shot. She didn't correct them. Let them have their stories. Let them believe she was something more than human. It made her job easier. One evening, 6 months after the battle, she and Cade sat on the porch of the new cabin, watching the sun set over mountains that had tried so hard to kill them. You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't chosen me that day? She asked. Sometimes, not often. He took a drink from the cup in his hand. Why? Because I keep thinking about that woman in the square, how scared she was, how certain she was that nobody would ever want her. And now I know she was right, nobody did want her. But that's okay because I'm not her anymore. Elira looked at him. You said you'd tell me something if we survived, about what you weren't letting me say. I remember. We survived. Cade was quiet for a long moment, staring at the sunset. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. I chose you because you were kind in a place that punished kindness, because you were strong when everyone told you that you were weak, because when I looked at you, I saw someone worth fighting for. He turned to face her, and somewhere along the way, fighting for you became the same as fighting for myself. Does that make sense? Yes, she said quietly, it makes sense. They sat in silence as the sun disappeared behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The mountains settled into darkness around them, no longer hostile, just present. Elira thought about everything that had led her to this moment. The mockery, the marriage, the violence, the fire. The way she'd been forced to become someone new, just to survive. The way that new person had turned out to be stronger than anyone expected. Thank you, she said, for choosing me. Thank you for being worth choosing. Somewhere in the forest, a wolf howled, not a threat, just a call to others of its kind. A reminder that they weren't alone on this mountain, that survival meant coexistence with things that could kill you if you weren't careful. But Elira wasn't afraid of wolves anymore. She'd faced worse and won. And if anything else came for them, raiders, corrupt officials, or just the grinding brutality of frontier life, she'd face that too. Because she was Elira Vos Mercer, the woman nobody wanted, and she'd proven that nobody's opinion mattered except her own. The first winter after the battle came early and stayed late. By October, snow was already piling up against the cabin walls, and by November the trails down to Black Hollow were barely passable. Elira had expected isolation, had even welcomed it after months of dealing with territorial bureaucrats and frontier disputes. But she hadn't expected the silence to feel so heavy. So, Cade seemed unbothered. He moved through the days with the same methodical efficiency he always had, checking trap lines, hunting, maintaining their supplies. But sometimes, Elira would catch him staring out the window at nothing, lost in thoughts he never shared. You're thinking about them, she said one night as they sat by the fire. Webb and Moss. He didn't deny it. They didn't have to stand with us, could have walked away, but they didn't. No, they didn't. He poked at the fire with a stick. Webb had a wife. Moss had a daughter living in the eastern settlements. They had reasons to stay alive, and they died anyway. You think we should have let Gaines take the land? I think there's no good answer. We fought and people died. We didn't fight and we'd probably be dead instead. He tossed the stick into the flames. Either way, someone pays the price. Before Elira could respond, they heard something outside, not the wind, not an animal. Horses, multiple riders approaching in the dark. They were armed and at the door before the first knock came. Mercer, a voice called. It's Quinn. Got 3 others with me. We need help. Cade opened the door cautiously. Quinn stood there with 3 other trappers, all of them looking half frozen and exhausted. One was bleeding from a wound on his shoulder. What happened? Cade asked, pulling them inside. Raiders, Quinn said, his teeth chattering. Hit my camp 2 days ago. Took everything. Furs, supplies, horses. Killed my partner. We tracked them north, but there's too many. Dozen at least, maybe more. Elira was already moving, heating water and pulling out medical supplies. The wounded man was younger, couldn't have been more than 19, and the bullet had gone clean through his shoulder. Lucky, considering. How long have they been operating? Cade asked. Month, maybe longer. They've hit 4 camps that we know of. Territorial soldiers won't come this far north in winter, so the bastards know they're safe. Where are they now? Last we saw, they were heading toward the old mining camp near Devil's Ridge. Place has been abandoned for years, but it's got shelter and defensible positions. Cade looked at Elira. She knew what he was thinking. This was exactly the kind of thing Hendricks had meant when he'd made them territorial liaisons. Handle the problems the government couldn't or wouldn't. We go after them, she said. It wasn't a question. It's not your fight, Quinn protested. I'm just asking if you know anyone who could help." "It became our fight when you rode up here asking," Cade said. He turned to the other trappers. "You men stay here. Rest, eat, tend to your wounded. We'll leave at first light. You can't go alone. There's too many of them." "We won't be alone." Cade moved to the corner where they kept their weapons. "I know a few people who owe me favors." They spent the night preparing. Cade sent messages to 3 other trappers he trusted, using a system of marked trails and signal fires that frontier people had developed to communicate across the vast distances. By dawn, 2 had responded they'd meet them on the trail. The 3rd sent no word, which probably meant no. Elira packed light: ammunition, dried food, medical supplies, extra clothes. Everything she'd need to survive in the wilderness while hunting men who wouldn't hesitate to kill her. "You don't have to come," Cade said as they saddled the horses. "This is going to be ugly." "When is it not ugly? I'm serious, Elira. These aren't territorial soldiers following orders. These are killers. They won't show mercy just because you're a woman." "Good thing I'm not planning to ask for mercy." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but you follow my lead. These situations go wrong fast." They rode out as the sun was coming up, their breath steaming in the frozen air. The temperature had dropped overnight, cold enough that the snow crunched like broken glass under the horses' hooves. They met the first trapper, a man named Briggs, at the fork in the trail. He was a massive man, thick through the chest and arms, with a beard that covered half his face. He carried a rifle that looked like it had been through a war. "Heard you're hunting raiders," he said by way of greeting. "You heard right. I'm in. Those bastards hit my cousin's camp last week. Didn't kill anyone, but they beat him bad enough he won't be trapping this season." The second trapper caught up with them an hour later. His name was Chen, and unlike most of the frontier trappers, he was from the Western Territories, Chinese by descent, but born in the mountains. He spoke with the same flat efficiency as Cade. "How many are we facing?" he asked. "Dozen confirmed, could be more. And there's 4 of us." "That's right." Chen smiled, cold and humorless. "I like those odds. Means we don't have to share the bounty." "There's no bounty," Elira said. "There's always a bounty. Territorial government pays for dead raiders, $50 a head. This isn't about money. For you, maybe. For me, it's dinner and new boots." He checked his rifle. "Doesn't mean I won't kill them just as dead." They reached Devil's Ridge by late afternoon. The old mining camp was exactly as Quinn had described. A collection of half-collapsed buildings clinging to the side of a mountain, with a single road leading in and out. Smoke rose from 2 of the structures, meaning the raiders were definitely there. Cade had them stop a mile out to scout the position. 2 guards at the main entrance, he said, watching through a spyglass. Another one on the roof of the largest building. Can't see inside, but I'm guessing most of them are there staying warm. "How do we approach?" Briggs asked. "We don't. Not directly." Cade collapsed the spyglass. "We wait until dark, then we move in from 3 sides. Briggs, you take the east approach. Chen, you go west. Elira and I will come straight up the road." "That's a lot of open ground," Chen observed. "It is, but they'll be looking outward, watching for threats from the forest. They won't expect someone to just walk up to the front door, because it's insane." "Exactly." They waited as the sun set and the temperature dropped even further. Elira checked her rifle for the 10th time, making sure everything was loaded and ready. Her hands were steady, but her heart was pounding. No matter how many times she did this, the moments before violence always felt the same, like standing on the edge of a cliff waiting to jump. "You ready?" Cade asked quietly. "No, but I'll do it anyway. That's all anyone can ask." When full dark came, they moved into position. Briggs disappeared into the eastern forest, silent despite his size. Chen vanished west like smoke, and Elira followed Cade straight down the road toward the mining camp, walking like they had every right to be there. The guards saw them when they were 50 yards out. Both men stood up, rifles raised. "That's far enough," one of them shouted. "State your business." "Looking for work," Cade called back. "Heard you might be hiring." The guards exchanged glances. "Who told you that?" "Man in Black Hollow. Said there was money to be made up here if a person wasn't too particular about the law." That got their attention. The first guard lowered his rifle slightly. "You trappers?" "Were. Territory's getting crowded. Figured we'd try something new." The second guard was smarter. He kept his rifle up. "You're Mercer, the one who killed Marshall Gaines." "That's right." "Then what the hell are you doing here? Thought you were working for the territorial government now." "I work for myself. Government just pays me sometimes." Cade took another step forward. "So you hiring or not?" The guards were completely focused on him now, which meant they didn't see Elira's hand moving toward her rifle, didn't see the shadows shifting in the forest on either side, didn't realize they were already dead. Cade's signal was simple. He took off his hat. Elira fired first, dropping the smart guard before he could react. Cade got the other one a heartbeat later. Simultaneously, shots rang out from the east and west as Briggs and Chen took out the guard on the roof and another who'd been hidden in the shadows. Then they were moving, rushing the buildings before anyone inside could organize a defense. The main structure's door was barred from the inside. Cade kicked it once, twice, then stepped back as Briggs hit it like a battering ram. The wood splintered and they poured inside. The interior was chaos. Men scrambling for weapons, shouting, trying to understand what was happening. Elira fired twice, dropping two of them before they could raise their rifles. Cade moved through the room like he was dancing, every movement precise, every shot lethal. Someone tackled Elira from the side, slamming her into the wall hard enough to knock the air from her lungs. She twisted, brought her knee up into his groin, then smashed the rifle butt into his face when he doubled over. He went down and didn't get up. The fight lasted maybe 2 minutes. When it was over, 9 men were dead and 3 were wounded badly enough. They wouldn't be a threat. Cade moved through the survivors, checking their wounds with clinical detachment. "Where's the rest of you?" One of them, a man with a gut wound that meant he'd be dead by morning, spat blood. "Go to hell. You're already there." Cade stood. "Question is whether you die slow or fast." "There's a cabin," another one gasped. He was younger, maybe 25, with a bullet through his lung. "Quarter-mile west, 4 more men. They're guarding the supplies." "Smart. Keep your loot separate from your sleeping quarters." Cade looked at Briggs. "You and Chen stay here. Make sure none of these 3 do anything stupid. Elira, you're with me." They found the supply cabin exactly where the dying man had said it would be. 4 men were inside, playing cards by lamplight, completely unaware their companions were dead. Cade kicked in the door and shot 2 of them before they could react. The third went for his gun, and Elira put a bullet through his chest. The fourth raised his hands. "Don't shoot, I surrender." "Smart," Cade said. He moved closer, rifle pointed at the man's head. "You in charge here?" "No, that was Morgan. He was in the main camp." "Morgan's dead. So are the rest. You're the last one." The man's face went pale. "Please, I got a family. I was just trying to make money." "By stealing from people trying to survive in these mountains? By killing their partners?" Elira's voice was cold. "Where's your family now?" "Back east. Colorado territory. I send them money every month." "Not anymore, you don't." She saw it in his eyes before he moved, the desperate calculation that he might be able to grab a weapon, might be able to kill them and escape. She shot him before his hand reached the knife on his belt. The body hit the floor and silence filled the cabin. "You didn't have to do that," Cade said quietly. He was surrendering. He was about to try to kill us. Maybe. Not maybe. Definitely. She ejected the spent shell and loaded a new round. "You saw it too." He had. That was the problem. They'd both become so good at reading violence, at predicting when someone was about to make a fatal mistake, that mercy had become almost impossible. How do you show compassion to someone when you know with absolute certainty they'll use that compassion to hurt you? They searched the cabin and found everything Quinn had described. Stolen furs, supplies, weapons, even some money. Enough to keep the surviving trappers going through the winter. When they returned to the main building, Briggs and Chen were dragging bodies outside. "The wounded ones?" Elira asked. "Dead," Chen said flatly. "Gut wound went septic fast. The other two just gave up. Stopped fighting for breath." It was a lie. Elira could see it in the way he wouldn't meet her eyes. They'd killed the wounded rather than deal with prisoners in the middle of winter, 100 miles from anything resembling justice. She wanted to be angry about it, wanted to feel something about the casual execution of helpless men, but she didn't feel anything except tired. They spent the night in the mining camp, taking turns on watch. In the morning, they loaded the stolen supplies onto pack horses and headed back to Cade's cabin. Quinn and the others were still there when they arrived, anxiously waiting for news. "It's done," Cade said, dismounting. "The raiders are dead. Your supplies are here." Quinn stared at the pack horses, then at them. "All of them? You killed all of them?" "Yes." "How many were there?" 13. The number hung in the air. 13 men dead in a single night. Not in battle, not in self-defense, but in what amounted to an execution raid. "Thank you," Quinn said finally. "I know that doesn't mean much, but thank you." After the trappers left with their recovered supplies, after Briggs and Chen had taken their share and ridden off to collect the territorial bounty, Elira and Cade were alone again. "This is what it's going to be like, isn't it?" she asked. "Someone has a problem, we go kill whoever caused it, then we come home and wait for the next problem." "Probably. That's not living. That's just surviving with extra steps." "What do you want me to say?" Cade's voice had an edge to it she rarely heard. "That we're going to retire, build a nice, quiet life where nobody bothers us. We burned that bridge when we killed Gaines. We're what we are now, might as well accept it." "And what are we?" He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "We're the ones who do what needs doing. Even when it's ugly, even when it costs us pieces of ourselves we're never getting back." Elira wanted to argue, wanted to say there had to be another way, that they could choose something different, but she knew he was right. The winter deepened and more requests for help came. A dispute between two trappers that turned violent. A family being harassed by a group of drifters. A woman whose husband had beaten her nearly to death and then fled into the mountains. They handled each situation the same way, with violence, efficiency, and a coldness that made Elira barely recognize herself. But people started to rely on them, started to see them as the only real law in a territory where official justice was weeks away and usually arrived too late to matter. One bitter January night, a young woman showed up at their door. She was maybe 18, thin and exhausted, with bruises on her face and fear in her eyes. "Please," she said when Elira opened the door, "I need help. They said you're the ones who help people." They brought her inside, gave her food and warmth, and slowly the story came out. She'd been promised work at a ranch 50 miles north. When she arrived, she found out the work was serving drinks to miners and doing whatever else the ranch owner demanded. When she refused, he locked her in a room. She'd escaped 3 days ago and had been running ever since. "He'll come after me," she said, her voice shaking. "He doesn't let his property walk away." "His property," Elira repeated, her voice flat. "That's what he calls us. The girls who work there, his property." Cade met Elira's eyes across the table. She saw her own rage reflected there. "What's his name?" she asked. "Dalton. Marcus Dalton. He owns the Red Creek Ranch." "I know it," Cade said. "Place has had rumors around it for years. Nothing anyone could prove." "Now we can prove it," Elira stood. "When do we leave?" "Dawn. But this one is different from the raiders. Dalton has money, connections. We kill him, there will be consequences." "I don't care." "You should. This could bring the territorial government down on us for real this time." Elira looked at the young woman sitting at their table, barely more than a girl, traumatized and desperate. She thought about that woman in the town square, the one everyone had mocked and dismissed, the one nobody had helped because she wasn't worth the trouble. Then let them come, she said. I'm done pretending there are good reasons to let bastards like Dalton exist. Cade studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, we'll do this together. They left at dawn, telling the girl to stay in the cabin and keep the door barred. The ride to Red Creek Ranch took most of the day. It was a large operation, bigger than Illyra had expected, with a main house, several outbuildings, and a bunkhouse for workers. They approached openly, riding straight up to the main house like they had business there. A man came out to meet them, middle-aged, well-dressed, with the soft hands of someone who didn't do physical labor. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but wary. "Marcus Dalton?" Cade asked. "I am, and you are?" "Cade Mercer. This is my wife, Illyra. We're here about a girl who escaped from your ranch 3 days ago." Dalton's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. Young woman, 18 years old, bruises on her face from where your men hit her." Illyra dismounted. "She's at our cabin right now, telling us everything about how you run this place." "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I run a legitimate business here." "Do you?" It wasn't a question. Cade dismounted too. "Then you won't mind if we look around." "Actually, I do mind. This is private property and you're trespassing." "We're territorial liaisons," Illyra said, "which means we have authority to investigate criminal activity. And I'm a property owner with rights. You want to search my ranch? Bring a warrant." They were at an impasse. Dalton was smart enough not to admit anything, and without physical evidence, they couldn't prove the girl's story. They could kill him right here. But that would make them murderers in the eyes of the law, no different from the raiders they'd just hunted down. Then Illyra heard it. A scream from one of the outbuildings, a woman's voice, terrified and desperate. She was moving before she consciously decided to, running toward the sound. Behind her, she heard Dalton shouting and Cade telling him to stay put. The outbuilding door was locked. Illyra kicked it once, twice, then Cade arrived and shot the lock off. Inside were 3 women, all young, all showing signs of abuse. They cowered when the door opened, clearly expecting more violence. "It's all right," Illyra said, keeping her voice gentle. "We're here to help. You're safe now." She turned to find Dalton standing behind them with 4 of his men, all armed. "You just made a big mistake," Dalton said, "breaking into my property, destroying my lock. That's illegal. I'm well within my rights to defend myself." "Try it," Cade said quietly. His hand was on his rifle. "Please." The standoff lasted 10 seconds, then Dalton smiled, confident and smug. "I don't need to. The territorial government will handle this. You've overstepped your authority and everyone knows it. By tomorrow there will be warrants for your arrest." He was right. They'd acted without proper authorization, had broken into his building based only on a scream. Any lawyer could spin this as an illegal search, but Illyra didn't care any more about legal technicalities. "You're going to let these women go," she said, "all of them. And you're going to pay them what you owe them for the time they've been here." Dalton laughed. "Or what? Or we burn this place down like we burned the valley, and we make sure you're inside when we do it." The smile faded from his face. He'd heard the stories about what happened to Marshall Gaines, about the battle on the mountain, about the raiders who disappeared into winter and never came back. "You wouldn't dare," he said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "Test me," Illyra replied. The silence stretched. Finally, Dalton jerked his head toward his men. "Pay them whatever we owe them, then get them off my property." They left an hour later with 5 women total, all of them riding double on Dalton's horses. The ranch owner watched from his porch, his expression promising revenge. "That's going to come back on us," Cade said as they rode away. "I know. He'll file complaints, maybe even criminal charges. We could lose everything." "I know." He looked at her. "Worth it?" Illyra glanced back at the women riding behind them, free for the first time in months or years, their eyes showing the first sparks of hope. "Yeah," she said, "it's worth it." Dalton's complaints reached the territorial capital within 2 weeks, just as Cade had predicted. The letter arrived on a grey February morning, delivered by a rider who looked half frozen and deeply uncomfortable with his assignment. Elira opened it while Cade was outside checking the trap lines, and the words might as well have been a death sentence written in official language. "Marcus Dalton has filed formal charges of trespassing, property destruction, and unlawful seizure of assets," she read aloud when Cade returned. "We are hereby notified that our status as territorial liaisons is suspended pending investigation. We are ordered to appear before a territorial judge in the capital within 30 days to answer these charges." Cade hung up his coat, his expression unreadable. "What's the penalty if we're found guilty?" "Prison. Maybe 5 years, maybe more depending on how the judge feels about people who ignore property rights. And if we don't show up, then we're fugitives. Every lawman in the territory will be looking for us." He sat down at the table, rubbing his face with both hands. "We knew this was coming. Knowing doesn't make it easier." The 5 women they'd rescued were still living in the cabin, crowded but safe. They'd been helping with chores, earning their keep while they figured out where to go next. One of them, the girl who'd first come to their door, was named Sarah. She entered the main room now, carrying an armload of firewood. "What's wrong?" she asked, reading their expressions. "Nothing you need to worry about," Elira said. "Is it about us? About what happened at Dalton's?" "It's complicated." Sarah set down the wood and crossed her arms. "You're in trouble because you helped us, aren't you? He's pressing charges." The silence was answer enough. "Then we'll testify," Sarah said firmly. "We'll tell them what he did, what he's been doing for years. They'll have to listen." "They won't," Cade said quietly. "Dalton has money and lawyers. You're just frontier women with no proof beyond your word. In a territorial court, that's not going to be enough. So you're just going to go to prison after everything you did for us? We're going to figure something out." But even as Elira said it, she wasn't sure what that something could be. Over the next few days, word spread about the charges. Trappers started showing up at the cabin, offering support in their rough, uncomfortable way. Quinn came with a petition signed by 30 frontier families, testifying to Cade and Elira's character. Keller brought money he'd saved, saying they'd need it for lawyers. Even Chen, who rarely showed sentiment about anything, stopped by to say he'd be willing to testify about the raider incident if it would help. "You two have done more for this territory than the government ever has," he said. "People remember that. But gratitude didn't translate to legal protection, and they all knew it." The worst part was watching the women they'd rescued prepare to leave. They couldn't stay indefinitely, and with Cade and Elira facing prison, the cabin wouldn't be a safe haven much longer. Sarah was heading east to stay with a cousin. The others had made similar plans, scattering back into the territory to rebuild their lives. "I wish we could do more," Sarah said the night before she left. "I wish there was a way to make people understand what you did for us." "Just survive," Elira told her. "Build something good, that's enough." After the women left, the cabin felt emptier than it had ever been. Just Elira and Cade, facing down the reality that they might lose everything they'd fought for. "We could run," Cade said one night. They were sitting by the fire, not touching but close. "Head west into the unclaimed territories, change our names, start over, and spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders? Better than prison. Maybe." Elira stared into the flames. "Or maybe we go to the capital and we fight this properly. Tell the truth about Dalton, about everything. Make them see what's really happening out here. The truth doesn't matter when the other side has money and influence." "Then what does matter?" He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know anymore." That might have been the saddest thing Elira had ever heard him say. Cade Mercer, who always had a plan, who always knew the next move, admitting he was lost. They made the trip to the territorial capital 3 weeks later, leaving the cabin locked and the trap lines untended. The journey took 6 days through melting snow and mud that sucked at the horses' hooves. By the time they reached the capital, Elira felt like she'd aged 10 years. The city was bigger than Black Hollow by an order of magnitude. Actual streets, buildings made of brick and stone. People who looked like they'd never spent a night wondering if they'd freeze to death. It felt alien, disconnected from the reality Elira had been living in. They met with a territorial lawyer named Morrison, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and skeptical eyes. "I'll be honest with you," he said after hearing their story. "This is not a strong case. Dalton has documentation proving ownership of his ranch. You have the testimony of women who, legally speaking, were his employees. Breaking into his property without a warrant was illegal, regardless of your intentions. So we're just supposed to let him keep doing what he's doing?" Elira asked. "I'm not saying that. I'm saying the law doesn't care about moral righteousness. It cares about procedure and proof." Morrison shuffled through papers. "However, if we can prove a pattern of criminal behavior at Dalton's ranch, we might be able to argue that your actions were justified under the authority granted to you as territorial liaisons." "How do we prove that? Or do we? We need more women willing to testify. We need documentation. We need evidence that can't be dismissed as hearsay." He looked at them over his glasses. "Do you have any of that?" They didn't. The women had scattered, most of them too frightened to come back and face Dalton in a courtroom. There was no documentation because Dalton was smart enough not to keep records of his crimes. The hearing was set for the following week. Cade and Elira spent that time trying to gather evidence, talking to anyone who might have information about Dalton's operation, but everyone was either too scared or too loyal to talk. On the 4th day, something unexpected happened. A woman walked into the boarding house where they were staying, asking for Elira specifically. She was older, maybe 50, with grey hair and eyes that had seen too much. Her name was Margaret, and she'd worked at Dalton's ranch 10 years ago. "I heard you were in town," she said, sitting across from Elira in the boarding house parlor. "Heard what you did. Figured it was time someone spoke up." "You worked for Dalton?" "Worked is a generous word. He brought me in promising honest employment. Kept me there through threats and violence for 2 years before I managed to escape." Her hands trembled slightly. "I've spent the last decade trying to forget. But when I heard he was still doing it, still hurting girls, I realized forgetting doesn't fix anything." "Will you testify?" "Yes, and I know others who will too. Women who got out over the years. We've all been hiding, too afraid to speak up. But if you're willing to stand against him, then so are we." By the time the hearing arrived, Morrison had assembled testimony from 8 women spanning a decade. All of them told similar stories, promises of legitimate work, followed by coercion, abuse, and imprisonment. It was a pattern so clear that even Dalton's expensive lawyers couldn't entirely explain it away. The hearing took place in a territorial courthouse, a solemn building that smelled like old wood and older secrets. Dalton sat at the prosecution table looking confident, flanked by 2 lawyers who probably cost more than most frontier families made in a year. The judge was an older man named Hartford, with white hair and a face that gave away nothing. He listened to the opening statements without expression, then began calling witnesses. Margaret testified first. She spoke clearly, methodically, laying out exactly what had happened to her at Dalton's ranch. The lawyers tried to discredit her, suggesting she was lying for money or revenge, but she never wavered. "I have nothing to gain from this," she said. "I have a job, a life, a home. I'm here because what happened to me was wrong, and what's still happening to other women is wrong, and someone needs to say it out loud." The other women followed, each one adding weight to the testimony. By the time the 4th woman finished speaking, even Dalton's lawyers looked uncomfortable. Then it was Elira's turn. She stood before the judge and told her story, not just about rescuing the women from Dalton's ranch, but about everything that had led to that moment. about being the woman nobody wanted in Black Hollow, about learning to survive in a place that killed the weak, about becoming someone who could look at injustice and refuse to walk away. "I know we broke the law," she said. "We went onto private property without permission. We destroyed a lock. We took women who were legally employed and removed them from their workplace. All of that is true. But here's what's also true. If we hadn't done those things, those women would still be prisoners. They would still be suffering, and Dalton would still be operating with impunity because the law is too slow and too far away to protect people on the frontier." "Are you saying the law doesn't matter?" Judge Hartford asked. "I'm saying the law should protect people, not just property, and when it fails to do that, someone has to step in, even if it means breaking that law, especially then." The judge was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to Dalton's lawyers. "Do you have witnesses to call?" They did. Ranch hands who swore Dalton was a fair employer, business associates who testified to his good character, even a few women who claimed they'd worked at the ranch and been treated well. But their testimony felt hollow compared to the raw truth the other women had provided. The hearing lasted 3 days. When it finally concluded, Judge Hartford announced he would need time to consider all the evidence before making a ruling. "Court is adjourned," he said. "I'll have a decision within 2 weeks." Those 2 weeks were agony. Cade and Elira stayed in the capital, unable to return home while the case hung over them. They spent their days walking the streets, not talking much, both of them trying not to think about what would happen if the ruling went against them. On the 13th day, a messenger arrived at the boarding house with a summons to return to court. The courtroom was packed when they arrived. Word had spread about the case, and people wanted to see how it would end. Dalton sat at his table looking smug, clearly confident in his victory. His lawyers had probably assured him that property rights would win out over emotional testimony. Judge Hartford entered, and everyone stood. He took his seat, arranged some papers, then looked directly at Cade and Elira. "This has been one of the most difficult cases I've presided over in 30 years, he began. "On one hand, we have clear evidence of illegal entry and property destruction. On the other, we have compelling testimony suggesting that property was being used for criminal purposes. The question before me is whether the end justifies the means and whether territorial liaisons have the authority to act on suspicion rather than evidence." He paused, and in that silence, Elira felt her entire future hanging by a thread. After reviewing all testimony and evidence, Hartford continued, "I find that while the defendant's actions were technically illegal, they were undertaken in good faith and resulted in the exposure of serious criminal activity. Therefore, I am dismissing all charges against Cade and Elira Mercer." The courtroom erupted. Dalton shot to his feet, shouting protests. His lawyers were trying to calm him while simultaneously arguing with the judge. But Hartford's gavel came down hard. "Furthermore," he said, voice cutting through the noise, "I am ordering a full investigation into the operations at Red Creek Ranch. Mr. Dalton, you will cooperate fully with territorial authorities, and any evidence of the crimes described in this hearing will result in criminal charges. This court is adjourned." They walked out of that courthouse into afternoon sunshine, and for the first time in months, Elira felt like she could breathe. "We won," she said, almost not believing it. "We survived," Cade corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" He thought about that. "Maybe not anymore." They spent one more night in the capital, celebrating with Morrison and the woman who testified. Margaret raised a glass of whiskey and proposed a toast. "To speaking up," she said, "even when you're scared, even when it costs you everything, because silence just lets the bastards win." They drank to that, all of them, women who'd survived things they shouldn't have survived and found the courage to stand up anyway. The next morning, Cade and Elira began the journey home. The mountain looked different when they finally reached it. Spring had fully arrived while they were gone, melting the last of the snow and bringing green back to the forest. The cabin stood exactly as they'd left it, weathered but solid, a testament to everything they'd built, but it wasn't empty. 12 people were gathered in the clearing, trappers, frontier families, even a few faces Elira didn't recognize. They'd come bearing gifts, food, supplies, a new door someone had carved with intricate designs, blankets, tools. Quinn stepped forward, looking embarrassed but determined. "We heard what happened. Figured you could use some help getting things back in order." "You didn't have to do this," Cade said. "Yeah, we did. You stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. That matters. That means something." Quinn looked around at the others, all nodding in agreement. "You're part of this community, whether you want to be or not, and communities take care of their own." They spent the day in celebration, sharing food and stories, laughing in ways that felt foreign after months of tension and violence. Children played in the clearing while adults talked about the future, about what it meant to build something lasting in a place that tried so hard to break you. As the sun started to set and people began heading home, Sarah appeared. She'd ridden back from the Eastern Territory specifically to see them. "I heard you won," she said. "I had to come thank you in person." "You don't owe us thanks," Elira replied. "Yes, I do. You gave me my life back. All of us. We'll never forget that." Sarah hesitated, then pulled out a letter. "This is from all of us, the woman you saved. We wanted you to have it." Elira opened the letter that night after everyone had left and the cabin was quiet again. It was written in multiple hands, different styles of writing that all said versions of the same thing. "Thank you for seeing us as human beings worth saving. Thank you for being brave when no one else was. Thank you for proving that sometimes the right thing matters more than the legal thing." She showed it to Cade, who read it without speaking. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back. "Keep that," he said, "for when you forget why we do this." "Will I forget?" "Everyone forgets eventually. It's easier than remembering." They sat on the porch as darkness settled over the mountains. The forest was alive with spring sounds, birds, insects, the wind through new leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, but it didn't sound threatening, just alive. "Do you ever think about that day?" Elira asked, "in the town square?" "Sometimes." "Do you regret it?" Cade looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the woman from the square, but the person she'd become. Someone scarred and strong, capable of violence and compassion in equal measure. Someone who'd learned to fight not because she wanted to, but because she refused to be a victim. "No, son," he said, "not even a little." "Why did you really choose me that day? The truth." He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said something she'd never expected. "Because I saw myself in you. Someone the world had decided wasn't worth anything. Someone who'd been beaten down so many times they almost believed it." He looked away, out at the darkening forest. "I thought if I chose you, if I proved that person could become something more, maybe it would mean I wasn't as broken as I thought I was. And did it? Prove that? I don't know, but I know this. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, and I'm glad I was there to see you figure that out." Elira felt tears prick her eyes, the first she'd cried in months. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of being truly seen by another person. "I'm glad too," she whispered. They sat there until the stars came out, two people who'd survived things they shouldn't have survived, who'd become something neither of them had planned to become, who'd found in each other not romance or salvation, but something more valuable, partnership. The months that followed brought changes to Black Hollow and the surrounding territory. Dalton's ranch was shut down after the investigation revealed evidence of everything the woman had testified to. He faced trial and was sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison. Other operations like his started closing down or cleaning up their practices, afraid of drawing the same attention. The territorial government, perhaps embarrassed by how close they'd come to prosecuting the people who'd exposed the corruption, expanded the authority of frontier liaisons. Cade and Elira were officially reinstated and given broader powers to investigate and act on suspected criminal activity. People started coming to them with problems, knowing they'd get real help, rather than bureaucratic runarounds. Disputes got settled, criminals got caught, and slowly the frontier became a place where law meant something beyond whoever had the biggest gun. But it wasn't perfect. It never would be. There were still violent men, still people who preyed on the weak, still injustice that slipped through the cracks. Cade and Elira couldn't fix everything, couldn't save everyone. But they tried, and that counted for something. 1 year after the hearing, they were sitting on their porch when a rider approached. It was Hendricks, the investigator who'd first made them territorial liaisons. He looked older, more worn down by whatever he'd been dealing with in the capital. "I wanted to see how you were doing," he said after accepting a cup of coffee, "and to deliver some news." "What news?" Cade asked. "The territorial governor wants to offer you an official position, regional marshal with full authority over this entire section of the frontier, salary, resources, legal backing, everything you'd need to do this work properly." Cade and Elira looked at each other. It was everything they could have wanted. Validation, support, the ability to actually help people without worrying about legal consequences. "What's the catch?" Elira asked. "You'd have to move to the capital 6 months out of the year. Administrative work, coordination with other marshals, that sort of thing. And you'd be subject to direct oversight from the territorial government. So we'd be working for them instead of with them." "Essentially, yes." They didn't need to discuss it. Cade shook his head. "Tell the governor we appreciate the offer, but we're fine where we are." "You're sure? This is a significant opportunity." "We're sure. We work for the people out here, not for politicians in the capital. That's not changing." Hendricks smiled like he'd expected that answer. "The governor thought you'd say that, which is why he authorized me to offer an alternative. You stay exactly as you are, but with increased funding and official backing for any actions you take in the course of your duties. No oversight beyond quarterly reports, no requirement to relocate. Just you two doing what you've been doing, but with the full weight of the territorial government behind you." "Why would they offer that?" Elira asked. "Because you're effective. Because people trust you, and because the frontier needs people who care more about justice than politics." He finished his coffee. "So, what do you say?" They said yes, of course, not because they needed the government's approval, but because having official backing meant they could help more people, prevent more violence, do more good. After Hendricks left, promising to send the official paperwork, Elira stood at the edge of the clearing, looking at the forest that had tried so hard to kill her, and had instead made her stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. "You thinking about the woman from the square?" Cade asked, coming to stand beside her. "Always. She feels like someone I used to know in another life. She's not gone completely. I still see her sometimes in the way you talk to people who are scared, the way you're patient even when you shouldn't be. Is that a good thing?" "It's necessary. We need that softness to balance out the hard parts." He took her hand, something he rarely did, but it felt right. "You can't just be iron all the time. You'd break." Elira squeezed his hand. "What are we, do you think? When people tell stories about us 50 years from now, what will they say? They'll probably get it wrong. Make us out to be heroes or villains or something we never were. But what's the truth?" Cade thought about that. "The truth is we were two broken people who found each other in a broken place and decided that maybe broken could still be useful. We couldn't fix ourselves, but we could try to fix some of the things around us, and sometimes that's enough." It was the most poetic thing she'd ever heard him say, and it was perfect precisely because it wasn't trying to be. They stood there as the sun set, two people who'd survived against impossible odds, who'd become legends without meaning to, who'd learned that strength wasn't about being fearless or perfect. It was about being afraid and imperfect and doing what needed doing anyway. Elira Voss had been the woman nobody wanted, the fat trapper's daughter who stood in the town square while people laughed, the one everyone expected to die alone and unmourned. but she'd become Elira Mercer, the Iron Woman, the one who burned down a valley to hold her ground, who stood up to corruption even when it cost her everything, who proved that the person you are doesn't matter nearly as much as the person you choose to become. And in a place as brutal as the frontier, where survival was never guaranteed and justice was usually just a word, she'd built something that mattered. Not a perfect life, not a fairy tale ending, but something real and hard-won and entirely her own. Years later, when people told stories about the woman who saved Black Hollow, they'd get the details wrong. They'd make her taller, stronger, more heroic. They'd smooth out the rough edges and remove the doubts and forget about the mistakes. But the people who'd actually known her, who'd been saved by her or fought beside her or simply witnessed what she'd become, they knew the truth. She hadn't been perfect. She'd been angry and scared and sometimes cruel. She'd made decisions that haunted her. She'd killed people who probably deserved better. She'd broken laws and bent rules and acted on instinct when she should have been more careful. But she'd also been kind when kindness cost her. She'd been brave when being brave meant dying. She'd stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, even when it would have been easier and safer to look away. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not whether she was good or bad, hero or villain, just that she'd been there, that she'd tried, that she'd refused to be the person everyone expected her to be, and had instead become the person the frontier needed. As the stars came out over the mountain and Cade went inside to start dinner, Elira stayed outside for one more moment, breathing in the cold air and feeling the weight of everything she'd been and everything she'd become. Somewhere in Black Hollow, there was probably still a woman standing in a metaphorical square, waiting for someone to tell her she was worth something. And maybe that woman would never get a Cade Mercer to choose her, would never get a chance to become something more. But maybe she'd hear the stories about Elira Voss. Maybe she'd learn that the world's opinion mattered less than her own determination. Maybe she'd find the strength to save herself. And if she did, if even one person heard these stories and decided to fight instead of accept defeat, then everything Elira had been through would mean something that was enough, that would always be enough. She turned and walked back into the cabin, where Cade was cooking and the fire was warm. And life continued in all its imperfect, hard-won, beautiful complexity. The woman nobody wanted had become the woman everyone needed. And she'd done it by refusing to apologize for taking up space in a world that had tried to make her disappear. That was the story. That was the truth. And nothing else really mattered.